By the time my father called me a supporter, never a leader, the laughter in the ballroom had already done its damage. It was the kind of room my parents had always loved, gold lights spilling from crystal chandeliers, white roses climbing the centerpieces, glasses catching the glow like everything inside that room had been polished for approval. There were 150 people there, maybe more. My father's partners, clients, friends who had known me since I was a child and still somehow looked at me like I was a temporary disappointment they expected my parents to outgrow. I was seated in the back, close enough to the kitchen doors to hear plates clatter every time they swung open. My husband sat beside me in a navy suit that fit him beautifully, though I knew my mother had already decided it looked too simple the second she saw him. Marcus had one hand resting near mine on the table, not touching, just there, steady, present, like he already knew I was holding myself together by habit and not by strength. On stage, my father lifted his glass and smiled the smile he saved for donors and camera flashes. "Madeline," he said, turning toward my younger sister near the front table, "has my instincts, my drive, my ability to lead." Applause filled the room so quickly you'd think he'd announced a miracle. My sister lowered her chin with that polished little smile she used whenever praise was expected, not earned. The diamonds at her ears caught the light. She looked exactly where she believed she belonged. Then my father's gaze moved across the ballroom until it found me. "And Avery?" He paused just long enough for people to turn. My stomach tightened. "She's always been different," he said. "Kind-hearted, supportive. The kind of person who helps from the sidelines." A few people nodded politely. Then he smiled wider. "A supporter, never a leader." This time the laughter was louder, easier. Not cruel enough for anyone to admit it was cruel, just soft enough to pass as a joke. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I just sat there with my hands folded in my lap like I was still 8 years old, still learning that humiliation delivered with a smile was the Parker family's favorite form of honesty. Across the room, my mother gave a tiny approving nod, as if my father had finally found the perfect words for what I had always been to them. Less impressive, less useful, less worth explaining. Beside me, Marcus slowly leaned back in his chair. I could feel the shift before I looked at him. His jaw had gone still. His eyes were fixed on the stage with a calm that scared me more than anger would have. Then he stood. And in that single quiet movement, something in the room changed. Because my husband did not look embarrassed. He looked finished. The first thing I felt when Marcus stood up wasn't relief. It was fear. Not because I thought he would embarrass himself, but because I knew exactly how my family worked. They had spent my entire life turning moments like this into proof that I didn't belong in their world. And if Marcus said the wrong thing, they would use it against me forever. The orchestra had just begun another soft jazz piece when he pushed his chair back. The sound barely carried, but the movement did. Heads turned slowly, like ripples spreading across the ballroom. "Marcus," I whispered. He looked down at me. His expression softened immediately, like the tension in him was never meant for me. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. That question almost broke me, because for 32 years, no one in my family had ever asked it when it mattered. "I'm fine," I said automatically. We both knew that wasn't true. Across the room, my father continued his speech, oblivious for the moment. "And of course, the future of Parker development will be in excellent hands," he was saying, nodding toward Madeline again. "Leadership like that doesn't happen by accident." Another wave of applause. Marcus glanced toward the stage, then back at me. "You don't have to stay," he said gently. "I know." But something in me refused to move. For years I had swallowed moments like this: Christmas dinners where my sister's deals were celebrated like national holidays. Sunday brunches where my career was mentioned like a childhood phase I hadn't grown out of yet. I had learned to sit still, to smile, to make myself smaller so the room stayed comfortable. Leaving now would just be another quiet retreat. And suddenly, I was tired of leaving. "I want to hear how it ends," I told him. Marcus studied my face for a second, the way he did when he was trying to understand what I hadn't said out loud. Then he nodded. "Okay." But he didn't sit back down. Instead, He turned toward the aisle. At the front of the room, my sister leaned toward one of my father's partners and laughed at something he said. Cameras flashed near the stage as a photographer moved closer. Everything about the room felt choreographed, every compliment, every smile, every carefully polished success story. Except Marcus. He walked forward slowly, hands relaxed at his sides, the calmest person in a room full of people performing confidence. A few guests shifted in their seats. Someone whispered, "Who's that?" My mother noticed first. Her eyes followed him across the floor, confusion tightening her expression before it hardened into something colder. Then my father saw him. He paused mid-sentence. "And yes," my father said into the microphone, clearing his throat as Marcus approached the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, excuse me for just a moment." The room quieted. Marcus stopped a few feet from the steps. For a second, I thought he might hesitate. He didn't. He walked up onto the stage like he had every right to be there. My sister's smile vanished instantly. "Avery," she called across the room, sharp enough to cut through the silence. "Come get your husband." A few people chuckled. Marcus reached the microphone before I could stand. He didn't look at my sister. He looked at my father. "Good evening," he said calmly. The microphone carried his voice across the ballroom, steady and clear. "My name is Marcus Reed." A pause spread through the crowd. Then he added one quiet sentence that made my stomach drop. "And I think it's time someone explains something about your daughter." For a moment, no one moved. The ballroom felt suspended in that strange silence that only happens when something unscripted interrupts a perfectly planned evening. My father stared at Marcus like a man trying to remember where he had seen a stranger before. "I'm sorry," he said into the microphone, forcing a polite chuckle. "Do we know each other?" A few people laughed softly, grateful for the chance to pretend this was still part of the program. Marcus didn't laugh. "No," he said calmly. "You don't." The room went still again. Behind him, the orchestra had stopped playing entirely. Even the servers near the kitchen doors had paused, trays balanced in their hands. My sister stepped closer to the stage, her smile stretched thin. "Marcus," she said sweetly, though her voice carried a warning I recognized from childhood. "Tonight is about Dad. Why don't we—" He didn't look at her. For the first time since he stood up, he turned toward the audience instead. "I won't take long," he said, "but I do want to say something before this evening continues." My mother had already risen from her chair at the front table. Her expression had that tight, practiced calm she used when something threatened the image she had spent decades building. "This really isn't necessary," she said carefully. "If you'd like to speak with Robert, we can arrange." Marcus lifted one hand slightly. Not rude. Just enough to pause her. "I've been quiet for 4 years," he said. "I think 30 seconds is fair." The words landed heavier than they sounded. People shifted in their seats now, curiosity slowly replacing discomfort. 4 years. Some of the guests had begun whispering to each other. At the back of the room, I realized something strange was happening. No one was laughing anymore. Marcus rested his hands lightly on the podium. "When I married Avery," he continued, "I understood that her family valued certain things." He said it gently, almost generously. Success, status, achievement. My father straightened his shoulders. "Well," he said stiffly, "those are hardly unreasonable values." "No," Marcus agreed. "They're not." Then he looked directly at him. "But assumptions about those things can be." A quiet murmur moved through the crowd. My sister crossed her arms. "I'm sorry," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "What exactly are you trying to say?" Marcus turned toward her now. "Only that in 4 years," he replied calmly, "not one person in your family has ever asked me a real question about my work." Madeline scoffed. "You said you work in education." "I do." She shrugged dramatically. "Well, there you go." A few people near her table laughed again. Marcus didn't react. He simply nodded once. "Yes," he said. "That's what I said." My father sighed, clearly eager to regain control of the room. "Marcus, was it?" he said. "I'm sure you mean well, but this isn't really the time for—" It became the time, Marcus said quietly, when you called your daughter a supporter. The room froze again. My father's smile disappeared. Marcus didn't raise his voice. But somehow every word reached the back wall of the ballroom. Avery has spent her life helping people succeed, he said. Children who couldn't read. Families who didn't have the resources other schools take for granted. My chest tightened. I hadn't expected him to say any of this. People like to think leadership looks like boardrooms and contracts, Marcus continued. He paused. Sometimes it looks like a third-grade classroom. A few guests shifted uncomfortably now. Because the room understood something had changed. This wasn't a joke anymore. This was a correction. Marcus reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. And that was the moment my mother's face finally lost its color. Because whatever Marcus was about to do, he had planned it. When Marcus reached into his jacket, the entire ballroom leaned forward. It was subtle, but you could feel it curiosity tightening the air like a string pulled too far. My father shifted beside the podium. Marcus, he said carefully, his voice tightening around the edges, perhaps we should continue this conversation another time. Marcus paused with his hand inside his jacket pocket. Then he looked at him. Another time, he repeated calmly. A faint smile touched his face. That's been the plan for 4 years. A few quiet murmurs drifted through the room. My sister stepped closer to the stage, clearly trying to regain control of the moment. This is getting ridiculous, Madeline said. You're making a scene. Marcus nodded once. Yes, he said. I am. The honesty of it caught everyone off guard. But his voice stayed steady. Because something should have been said a long time ago. I felt my hands tighten in my lap. Part of me wanted to stand up and stop him to protect him from the slow, cutting politeness my parents used when they wanted someone to feel small. But another part of me, the part that had been quiet for years, needed to hear what he would say. Marcus finally pulled something from his jacket. Not the envelope I had seen the night before. His phone. For a moment, confusion crossed my father's face. Marcus unlocked the screen and turned it slightly toward the crowd. Some of you might recognize this, he said. The large screen behind the stage suddenly flickered. One of the event technicians had mirrored his phone without even thinking, probably assuming this was part of the program. The ballroom projector lit up, and suddenly Marcus's screen filled the entire wall behind him. A website appeared. Clean design, blue and white interface. At the top was a logo. EduSpark. A quiet murmur spread through the room. I heard someone whisper behind me. Wait, isn't that… My sister laughed sharply. Oh my God, she said, shaking her head. You're showing us a website? Marcus didn't respond. Instead, he tapped the screen. The page scrolled. Articles. Partnership announcements. Education initiatives across the country. Then another tap. A magazine cover appeared. The crowd grew quieter. My father squinted at the screen. What exactly are we looking at? He asked. Marcus looked back at the audience. This, he said calmly, is the company I run. The words landed softly, but the room reacted like someone had dropped glass on marble. A woman near the center tables leaned forward. Another guest pulled out his phone. Madeline's smile faltered. Run? She repeated. Marcus nodded. Yes. A few people in the front rows were already typing on their phones now. Searching. The silence grew thicker. Then someone near the stage gasped. Oh. It wasn't loud, but it carried. Another guest turned their phone toward the person beside them. 2 more screens lit up, and suddenly the whisper started spreading table to table. EduSpark. 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 I saw the exact moment Jennifer Lawson, one of my father's biggest investors, recognized the name. Her eyes snapped up to the stage. She stared at Marcus like she had just remembered something she couldn't believe she'd forgotten. Oh my God, she breathed. My father frowned. What is everyone looking at? Jennifer stood up. Robert, she said slowly. You never told me your son-in-law was that Marcus Reed. The room fell into stunned silence. My father blinked. I'm sorry, what? Jennifer turned fully toward the stage now. Her voice carried across the ballroom. The founder of EduSpark. Every phone in the room lit up at once. And suddenly, the entire tone of the evening shifted. Because the man my parents had seated near the kitchen was the most important person in the room. For a few seconds after Jennifer said it, no one spoke. It was the strangest silence I had ever heard, thick, disbelieving, like the room itself was trying to catch up with reality. My father blinked twice. "I'm sorry," he said slowly, glancing from Jennifer to Marcus. "Did you say, founder?" Jennifer let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Yes, Robert, founder." She turned toward the audience as if she couldn't believe she was the only one explaining this. EduSpark runs one of the fastest-growing digital education platforms in the country. Over 8 million students use it. The whispers exploded. Phones appeared in hands across the ballroom. Screens lit up like tiny lanterns. People were searching now, confirming. And the moment they did, I watched their faces change. First, curiosity. Then recognition. Then shock. Madeline's voice cut through the noise. "That's ridiculous," she said sharply. Her heels clicked against the floor as she moved closer to the stage. "This is some kind of misunderstanding." Marcus didn't react. He simply stood beside the podium, hands relaxed, watching the room process the truth at its own pace. My father finally found his voice again. "If this is some kind of joke—" "It isn't," Jennifer said quietly. She was still staring at Marcus. "I met you at the Boston EdTech conference last year," she said. "You gave the keynote about access to education." Marcus nodded once. "That sounds right." The room went quieter again. Because now it wasn't just an article on someone's phone. Now there was a witness. Someone credible. Someone important. My mother looked like the air had been pulled out of her lungs. "But you said you worked in education," she whispered. Marcus finally turned toward her. "I do." His voice stayed calm. "I just never felt the need to explain it further." A few people near the front laughed softly, not mocking this time, but stunned. Madeline's face had gone pale. "That's impossible," she said again, though her voice sounded smaller now. "You live in a 2-bedroom apartment." Marcus shrugged lightly. "I like the neighborhood." More laughter rippled through the crowd. But it wasn't cruel laughter anymore. It was the kind people make when the story they thought they understood suddenly collapses. My father gripped the edge of the podium. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "that for 4 years you've been sitting at my dinner table." Marcus finished the sentence for him. "And you never asked what I actually do." Then he looked across the room, straight at me. And the softness in his expression returned. "I wasn't hiding," he said gently. "You just never looked. You just never looked." The sentence hung in the air like something fragile. For the first time that night, no one tried to laugh it off. My father's mouth opened slightly, but nothing came out. He looked around the ballroom as if hoping someone else would step in and explain the moment away for him. No one did. Because now everyone was looking at him. The room had shifted in a way that couldn't be undone. Marcus hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't insulted anyone. He had simply said the truth. And the truth had landed harder than any argument ever could. My mother gripped the back of her chair. "But why wouldn't you say something?" she asked, her voice unsteady now. Marcus considered the question. Then he answered simply. "Because Avery asked me not to." 150 heads turned toward me. I felt heat rise in my face. For years, I had been the quiet one at these events. The daughter who smiled politely. The one who changed the subject when conversations drifted toward money or titles. Marcus knew that. He had respected it. "I didn't want to embarrass her family," he continued gently, "even when the jokes weren't really jokes." My sister folded her arms tighter. "No one was joking," Madeline said defensively. "We just didn't know." Marcus nodded. "That's exactly the point." Jennifer Lawson was still standing near the front table, watching everything unfold with a look that mixed disbelief and fascination. "You've been trying to get a meeting with Parker Development for months," she said suddenly. Marcus glanced at her. Yes. And Robert told me he didn't know anyone in education technology. A ripple moved through the crowd. My father looked like someone had quietly removed the floor beneath him. Well, he said stiffly, there must have been some confusion. Marcus didn't argue. He simply reached into his jacket again. This time, he pulled out the thick white envelope I had seen the night before. I felt my heart start to pound. Even now, I didn't know exactly what was inside. Marcus placed the envelope on the podium. I actually came tonight planning to give this to you privately, he said, looking at my father. But after what was said earlier, I think it's better everyone hears it. The room leaned forward again. My father's voice dropped. What is it? Marcus opened the envelope slowly and removed a document. He held it up just long enough for the EduSpark logo to be visible at the top. This, he said calmly, is a grant agreement. Someone in the audience whispered, a grant? Marcus nodded. $5 million. The whisper turned into stunned silence. For STEM programs in underfunded schools across Massachusetts. Then he turned his head slightly and looked directly at me. The first school on the list, he said quietly, is Avery's. For a moment after Marcus said it, I didn't understand the words. The first school on the list is Avery's. My brain heard them, but it took a second for the meaning to catch up. Then the room reacted. Not loudly, not all at once, but like a wave of air moving through the ballroom. 5 million? Did he say 5? Her school? People weren't laughing anymore. They were staring at me. Not the polite, distant looks I had learned to ignore over the years. This was different. Curious, surprised, almost respectful. Marcus held the document steady on the podium. This grant will fund science labs, teacher training, and technology access in schools that have been overlooked for too long, he said. His voice remained calm, measured. Like this wasn't a dramatic reveal. Just a fact. Lincoln Elementary is the pilot program. My school. The place where I spent half my evenings cutting out worksheets and taping together broken reading corners because our budget barely covered textbooks. My throat tightened. Across the ballroom, my mother pressed a hand against her chest. You're giving her school $5 million? She whispered. Marcus turned toward her. No, he said gently. I'm investing in the teachers who keep showing up when no one else does. Then he looked at me again. And Avery is one of them. Something inside me cracked open. Not because of the money. Not because of the room full of people suddenly realizing I wasn't the disappointing daughter they thought I was. But because someone had finally said it out loud. That what I did mattered. My father stared at the document like it might disappear if he blinked. You're serious? He asked. Marcus nodded. Yes. The silence stretched. My sister looked like she had swallowed something sour. This is unbelievable, she muttered. Jennifer Lawson stepped forward again, studying the grant agreement on the podium. You were planning to announce this tonight? She asked. Marcus shook his head slightly. No. He glanced toward my father. I planned to hand it to him quietly. My father blinked. Why me? Marcus answered without hesitation. Because I thought a man celebrating 40 years of building something would understand the value of building something for others. The sentence landed softly, but it carried. And in that moment, for the first time all night, my father had no reply. Not a speech. Not a joke. Not a single word. Just silence. The silence in the ballroom stretched longer than anyone expected. My father stood behind the podium, staring at the document Marcus had placed there, as if the paper itself had betrayed him. For 40 years, he had been the one controlling the room, the one explaining deals, the one introducing powerful people, the one everyone listened to. Now he looked like a man who had lost the script. My mother spoke first. Her voice was smaller than I had ever heard it. Avery, why didn't you tell us? The question floated across the ballroom. I felt every pair of eyes turn toward me again. For a second, I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was the exact question that proved nothing had changed. I stood slowly. My legs felt unsteady, but my voice didn't. Tell you what, I asked. That Marcus built a company? My mother said. That he's successful? Successful. The word sounded different coming from her now. Careful, respectful. I looked at Marcus for a moment, then back at my parents. Would it have mattered? I asked quietly. My father frowned. Of course it would have mattered. Really? The room stayed perfectly still. For 4 years, I said. You never asked him what he actually does. My sister shifted impatiently. Well, how were we supposed to know? Madeline said. He said he worked in education. Marcus answered before I could. I did, he said. Madeline threw her hands up. Exactly. Marcus met her eyes calmly. That's the answer most teachers give when someone doesn't really want to hear the details. A few people in the crowd nodded, because they understood exactly what he meant. My father straightened slightly, trying to regain control of the moment. Well, he said stiffly, if there's been some misunderstanding, we can certainly correct that moving forward. Marcus looked at him. For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then he spoke quietly. This was never about misunderstanding. My father's jaw tightened. Then what is it about? Marcus didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced toward me, and something in his expression softened again. Then he turned back to the room. It's about respect, he said. The word landed gently, but the entire ballroom heard it. Marcus rested one hand on the podium. For 4 years, he continued, I watched Avery sit through conversations where her work was treated like a hobby. I felt my chest tighten. Where helping children learn was somehow less impressive than closing a real estate deal. No one laughed this time, because everyone knew exactly who those comments had come from. Marcus took a slow breath. And tonight, he said calmly, you didn't just insult me. His eyes moved toward my parents. You insulted her. You insulted her. The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. The entire ballroom had already gone so quiet that even the soft hum of the chandeliers seemed louder than before. My father shifted his weight behind the podium. That wasn't the intention, he said stiffly. Marcus didn't argue. He simply looked at him. Intentions, I realized in that moment, had never mattered much in my family. Only outcomes. And the outcome tonight was unmistakable. Marcus rested both hands lightly on the podium. For 4 years, he said calmly, I've listened to conversations about success. He nodded toward the front tables where my father's partners sat. Deals, acquisitions, profits. No one interrupted. Those things matter, Marcus continued. They build companies. They create jobs. My father straightened a little at that. But Marcus wasn't finished. But they're not the only way to build something meaningful. His gaze moved across the room slowly. Then it landed on my father again. Your daughter builds people. My throat tightened. Marcus continued quietly. She helps 8-year-olds believe they're not stupid when they struggle to read. He paused. She stays after school with students whose parents work 2 jobs. Another pause. She spends her own money on supplies when the district runs out halfway through the year. I heard someone in the audience whisper softly. Because suddenly the story of my life, my ordinary, invisible life, was being spoken out loud. Marcus nodded toward the document on the podium. That grant isn't charity. He tapped the paper gently. It's infrastructure. My father frowned slightly. What does that mean? It means teachers like Avery shouldn't have to fight for basic tools. The room absorbed the sentence. Jennifer Lawson crossed her arms thoughtfully, studying the document again. Madeline let out a quiet scoff. So what? Now she's a hero? Marcus didn't react to the tone, but his answer came immediately. Yes. The simplicity of it landed like a stone in water. Madeline blinked. You're serious? Marcus nodded once. Completely. Then he looked at the crowd again. Anyone who spends their life helping children discover they're capable of more than they thought, he paused, is leading something bigger than any company I've built. The silence that followed felt different from before. Not tense, reflective. And for the first time in 32 years, I watched a room full of people look at me not with pity, but with something much closer to respect. Then Marcus said something that changed everything again. I didn't come up here to embarrass anyone. He looked directly at my parents. I came up here because Avery deserves better. The moment Marcus said, Avery deserves better, something inside me finally broke. Not in the way people expect. Not anger. Not revenge. It felt more like a door quietly opening after being locked for years. For most of my life, I had believed something was wrong with me. That maybe my parents were right. Maybe I was the child who didn't try hard enough. Maybe teaching third grade really was small compared to boardrooms and contracts. Maybe my sister deserved the spotlight because she chased bigger things. Those doubts had followed me for years. But standing in that ballroom watching Marcus defend me in front of 150 people who had spent their lives measuring worth in dollars, I realized something. The problem had never been my life. It had been their definition of value. My father cleared his throat, still trying to regain control of the room. Well, he said carefully, this has certainly been enlightening. The word sounded strained, like he was trying to wrap the moment back into something polite. Jennifer Lawson spoke before he could continue. Robert, she said quietly, you realize what just happened here, right? My father frowned. I'm not sure I follow. Jennifer gestured toward Marcus. You've been trying to enter the education technology space for 2 years. That's correct. And the founder of one of the most influential platforms in the country has been sitting at your dinner table. A few people chuckled softly. Not cruelly, just at the absurdity of it. My father looked at Marcus again, this time with a different kind of interest. Well, he said slowly, perhaps we should discuss a partnership. The room went still. Marcus didn't answer immediately. He glanced at me first. Then he looked back at my father. No. The word was calm. Final. My father blinked. I beg your pardon? The opportunity for that conversation was 4 years ago. A quiet murmur spread through the crowd again. Marcus continued. Back when the most important thing in the room wasn't a valuation number. My father's expression hardened. You're going to turn down a business opportunity because of family misunderstandings? Marcus shook his head. No. He rested one hand lightly against the podium. I'm turning it down because respect shouldn't depend on a Forbes article. The sentence landed hard. If this moment feels familiar to anyone listening right now, if you've ever been dismissed until someone realized your value, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. Stories like this connect people from everywhere. And if you believe dignity should never be negotiable, subscribe and stand for dignity. Back in the ballroom, my mother looked close to tears. Avery, she said softly, we didn't mean to hurt you. For the first time all night, I stepped forward. And when I spoke, my voice was steadier than it had ever been. Intentions don't erase patterns, I said. The room listened. For once, everyone was listening to me. For a long moment after I said it, no one spoke. Intentions don't erase patterns. The sentence sat quietly in the center of the room, like something fragile everyone was suddenly afraid to touch. My mother's eyes filled with tears, but I couldn't tell if they were real grief or the shock of losing control of a narrative she had managed for decades. My father looked less emotional. He looked calculating. I recognized that expression immediately. It was the same face he used when negotiations didn't go the way he expected. Avery, he said carefully, we may have been overly critical at times. A few people shifted in their chairs. Even they could hear how small those words were compared to everything that had happened. Overly critical. Like my life had been a quarterly report they weren't satisfied with. Marcus said nothing. He simply stepped back slightly, giving me the space to speak for myself. That small gesture meant more than anything he had said all night. My sister broke the silence next. This is unbelievable, Madeline muttered, shaking her head. You're acting like we abused you. Her voice carried just enough irritation to remind me that, in her mind, she was still the reasonable one. You chose this life, she continued. You chose a career that barely pays anything. Several guests looked uncomfortable now, because suddenly the quiet judgments that had always lived under the surface of conversations were being spoken out loud. I felt something strange then. Not anger. Not embarrassment. Just clarity. Yes, I said. Madeline blinked. Yes? She repeated. Yes, I said again, calmer this time. I chose it. The words felt surprisingly light. I chose a job where I watch kids realize they're capable of more than they believed. I glanced toward Marcus for a moment before continuing. I chose a husband who respects people even when they don't respect him. The room remained still. And I chose not to spend my life chasing approval that was never actually available. My father exhaled slowly. That's not fair. I met his eyes. What part of it isn't? He hesitated. For the first time in my life, I watched my father struggle to answer a direct question. Finally, he said, "We just wanted you to reach your potential." I nodded slightly. I did. He frowned. "You're a teacher." Yes. The word didn't sound defensive anymore. It sounded certain. My mother wiped her eyes. But you could have done so much more. I thought about my classroom. About Emma sounding out words for the first time last month. About the way my students cheered when someone finally solved a math problem they had been stuck on all week. I looked back at my parents. I already am. When I said it, I already am. Something shifted in the room again. Not dramatically. No gasps. No applause. Just a quiet change in the way people looked at me. For most of my life, conversations with my parents had followed the same script. They asked questions that weren't really questions, offered advice that was really criticism, and waited patiently for the moment I would admit they were right. This time, that moment didn't come. My father rubbed the bridge of his nose like a man trying to reset the conversation. "Avery," he said, lowering his voice slightly, "this isn't the place for a family dispute." That line almost made me smile. Because for years, every family dinner had been the place where my life was dissected like a failed investment. But suddenly now it wasn't appropriate. "You made it the place," I replied gently. A few guests shifted again. Not uncomfortable exactly, more like people realizing they had accidentally walked into a very honest moment. My mother looked around the ballroom nervously. "Everyone is watching," she whispered. "Yes," I said. And for the first time, that didn't terrify me. Marcus stepped closer beside me, not interrupting, just standing there with that steady presence that made everything feel calmer. My father cleared his throat again. "Well," he said stiffly, "this has clearly gotten out of hand." Jennifer Lawson tilted her head slightly from the front table. "Actually," she said, "I think it's gotten honest." My father looked irritated now. "This is a private family matter." Jennifer gave a small shrug. "Robert, you held it in a ballroom with a microphone." A few people laughed quietly. Not cruelly. Just truthfully. Madeline looked like she might explode. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "You're embarrassing the entire family." The word embarrassing hung in the air. I thought about that. For years I had believed my job embarrassed them. My salary embarrassed them. My life embarrassed them. But suddenly, the room felt very clear. "No," I said quietly. Madeline frowned. "No what?" "This isn't embarrassing." She stared at me. "This," I continued calmly, "is just the first honest conversation we've ever had." My mother shook her head slowly. "You're making it sound like we never supported you." I didn't answer right away. Instead, I asked the question that had lived in the back of my mind for years. "Did you ever come to my classroom?" Silence. My father looked confused. "What? Did either of you ever visit my school?" They didn't answer. Because the truth was obvious. 32 years of family dinners. Dozens of conversations about Madeline's deals. But not once had either of them sat in one of the tiny blue chairs in my classroom. I nodded slowly. "That's what I thought." Across the room, someone quietly set down a glass. Because now, everyone understood something my parents had never noticed before. This moment wasn't about Marcus. It was about me. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't shrinking away from it. For a moment after that question, the room stayed perfectly still. Not the polite, quiet people use during speeches. This was the kind of silence that only happens when everyone realizes the truth at the same time. My father shifted uncomfortably behind the podium. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "we were busy running a company." It was meant to sound reasonable, responsible. But in that room, after everything that had already been said, the words landed differently. "Busy." I nodded slowly. "I know. Because I did. I had known it my entire life. Busy meant missing school plays. Busy meant canceled birthday dinners. Busy meant every conversation somehow circling back to deals, contracts, numbers. Busy had always been the explanation, but it had never really been the reason. My mother tried again. "We always believed in your education," she said softly. "You went to the best schools." "Yes," I agreed. "That's true." She looked relieved for a second, like maybe we had found common ground. But I continued. "You invested in my future." My father nodded. "Exactly." I looked at both of them. "But you were never interested in my life." The relief disappeared. Madeline shook her head in disbelief. "You're twisting everything." "No," I said calmly. "I'm finally saying it clearly." The ballroom remained quiet, but it didn't feel tense anymore. It felt attentive. Like everyone in the room understood this moment wasn't really about money or companies or even Marcus's success. It was about something simpler. Recognition. My father crossed his arms now. "So, what exactly do you want, Avery?" The question surprised me. Not because of the words, but because of the tone. For once, he wasn't telling me what I should want. He was actually asking. I thought about that for a moment. About the little girl who used to wait by the window when she had a school performance. About the teenager who stopped mentioning achievements because the conversation would drift back to Madeline's career anyway. About the adult who kept showing up to family dinners, even when every joke chipped away at her confidence. What did I want? It turned out the answer was simpler than anyone expected. "Respect," I said. My father frowned slightly. "That's it?" "Yes." I gestured toward the room. "Not applause. Not approval. Just respect." Madeline scoffed. "You're making this dramatic." Marcus finally spoke again, his voice calm beside me. "No," he said. "She's making it clear." My father looked from Marcus to me, like he was seeing something he had never noticed before. Something steady. Something that wasn't going to bend just to keep the peace. And for the first time all evening, he didn't try to interrupt. The quiet that followed felt heavier than any argument. My father stood there, looking at me like he was trying to understand when exactly I had stopped being the quiet daughter who nodded and let things go. For years, that version of me had made life easier for everyone. Now she was gone. My mother spoke carefully. "We always respected you, Avery." The sentence sounded practiced, like something she hoped would repair the moment. I shook my head gently. "No," I said. "You tolerated me." A few people shifted in their chairs. Not because the words were harsh, but because they were accurate. Madeline rolled her eyes. "Oh, come on." She stepped closer, clearly done pretending patience. "You're acting like you grew up in some terrible environment." Her voice carried the same dismissive tone it always had. "You had every opportunity." "I did," I said. "And I used them." She laughed sharply. "To become a third-grade teacher." The way she said it would have humiliated me once. Years ago, I might have shrunk under the weight of that sentence. Tonight, it didn't land the same way. Because now the room had context. They had heard Marcus. They had heard the truth behind the work. I looked at her calmly. "Yes," I said. Madeline frowned. "That's not the comeback you think it is." "It's not a comeback." I paused. It's just my life. Marcus rested a quiet hand on the back of my chair. Not to guide me. Just there. Steady. Across the room, Jennifer Lawson watched the exchange with thoughtful interest. My father exhaled slowly. So what happens now? He asked. The question felt genuine this time. Not defensive. Not strategic. Just uncertain. I thought about it. About the years behind us. About the students waiting in my classroom Monday morning. About the life Marcus and I had built far away from my parents' expectations. The answer came easily. Now, I said calmly, you decide whether you can treat me like your daughter. I let the words settle. Not your disappointment. Your daughter. The words lingered in the air longer than I expected. Your daughter. Not your problem. Not your disappointment. Just your daughter. My father looked at me in a way I had never seen before. Not with frustration or impatience. Not with the quiet calculation he usually wore in business meetings. This time, he looked uncertain. My mother sat slowly back in her chair, as if the weight of the evening had finally caught up with her. For years, our family conversations had always ended the same way. Someone changed the subject. Someone laughed something off. And the uncomfortable truth quietly disappeared. Tonight, that escape route didn't exist. Madeline was the first to break the silence. So what? She said sharply. We're all supposed to apologize now? Her voice cut across the room, brittle with disbelief. This entire night has turned into some kind of lecture. No one responded. Because suddenly the room understood something Madeline didn't. This wasn't a lecture. It was a mirror. My father finally spoke again, his voice lower now. Madeline, he said quietly. But she shook her head. No, seriously, she continued. Everyone is acting like Avery has been some kind of victim. She gestured toward Marcus. And now suddenly we're all supposed to feel terrible because her husband turned out to be rich? Marcus didn't react. He didn't defend himself. He didn't interrupt. Instead, I answered, That's not what this is about. Madeline laughed again. Please. I held her gaze. If Marcus had walked into this room tonight making minimum wage, I said calmly, everything I said would still be true. The sentence settled into the room. And for the first time, Madeline had no quick reply. Because deep down, everyone there understood the difference. This moment wasn't about wealth. It was about the way people had chosen to treat someone when they believed she had none. Across the room, Jennifer Lawson spoke softly. She's right. Madeline blinked. Jennifer leaned back in her chair. Respect shouldn't require a balance sheet. Jennifer's words settled over the room like a quiet verdict. Respect shouldn't require a balance sheet. No one argued with her. Even the people who had laughed earlier now looked uncomfortable, as if they were replaying the evening in their heads and realizing how easily they had joined in. Madeline crossed her arms tightly. This is unbelievable, she muttered. You're all acting like we're villains. No one answered her. Not because they agreed, but because the room had moved past the argument. My father remained standing near the podium, staring at the document Marcus had placed there. $5 million. Not for a business. Not for an investment. For a school. For my school. Finally, he looked up. Avery, he said. The way he said my name felt different. Quieter. Not performative. I waited. He took a slow breath. I didn't realize how much this mattered to you. For a second, I almost said the easy thing. Something polite. Something that would help the evening end smoothly. But that was the old pattern. And tonight had already broken too many of those. It always mattered, I said gently. My mother wiped at her eyes again. We thought you were settling, she whispered. For less. I shook my head. No. My voice stayed calm. I chose something meaningful. Madeline scoffed again, but it sounded weaker this time. Marcus stepped slightly closer beside me. Not to speak. Just there. My father looked at him for a moment, then back at me. I suppose, he said slowly, we owe you an apology. The words sounded unfamiliar coming from him, like a language he had never really practiced. I studied his face. For once, I wasn't searching for approval, just sincerity. Around us, the ballroom waited, because everyone understood something important. What happened next wouldn't change the past, but it would decide what came after it. My father's words lingered in the quiet. "We owe you an apology." For most of my life, hearing that sentence would have felt like victory. But standing there now, it didn't feel like winning. It felt complicated. Because apologies don't rewrite childhood. They don't erase the years of small dismissals, the dinners where my life was reduced to a polite nod before the conversation returned to Madeline's latest deal. Still, I could see something different in my father's face. Not pride, not control. Something closer to humility. My mother spoke next, her voice trembling. "Avery, we truly didn't understand." I believed that part. Not because they had tried and failed, but because they had never really tried. "Understanding isn't the issue," I said gently. They both looked at me. "Listening is." The sentence wasn't sharp, just honest. My father nodded slowly, like he was absorbing something he should have learned years ago. Madeline looked away, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the moment. "So what now?" she muttered. No one answered her. Because the answer wasn't simple. Families rarely repair themselves in one conversation. But something had shifted. My father stepped away from the podium and walked toward me. For a second, the room held its breath again. When he stopped in front of me, he didn't try to shake Marcus's hand. He didn't talk about business. He looked at me. "His daughter. I'm proud of you," he said quietly. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of years. I held his gaze for a moment, and then I nodded. Not because everything was fixed, but because, for the first time, he had finally said it. For a few seconds after my father said it, the ballroom stayed quiet. "I'm proud of you." Those were words I had imagined hearing many times growing up. Sometimes after a report card, sometimes after a school event, sometimes after a small victory that meant everything to me. But life rarely follows the timing we expect. The words had arrived decades late, and yet, they still mattered. Not because they erased the past, but because they were honest. My mother stepped closer, her voice softer than I had ever heard it. "We should have seen it sooner," she said. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I looked around the ballroom. The chandeliers still glowed. The orchestra members waited quietly with their instruments resting in their laps. Guests who had come expecting a celebration of business success were witnessing something far more personal. Growth. Messy, uncomfortable growth. Marcus's hand rested gently at the small of my back, steady as always. Madeline finally spoke again, though her voice had lost its sharp edge. "So, that's it?" she asked. No one rushed to answer. Because the truth was simple. This wasn't the end of anything. Families don't transform in a single evening. Trust isn't rebuilt with one apology. But something had shifted. A door had opened that had been closed for a long time. My father glanced back at the podium where the grant agreement still rested. $5 million, he murmured. Marcus nodded. "For the students," he said. My father looked at me again. And this time, there was no comparison in his eyes. No disappointment, just recognition. And for the first time in my life, that was enough. The orchestra didn't start playing again right away. For a long moment after everything that had been said, the ballroom simply existed in a kind of quiet reflection. People who had arrived expecting a polished retirement celebration were now sitting in their chairs, watching a family slowly confront something much deeper than business. My father eventually turned back toward the stage. The microphone was still there, waiting. For 40 years he had known exactly what to say into that microphone. He had delivered speeches about success, growth, and strategy without ever hesitating. Tonight was different. He walked back to the podium slowly and looked out at the room. "Well," he said after a moment, his voice calmer than before, "this evening certainly didn't go exactly as planned." A few gentle laughs moved through the crowd. Not mocking, just understanding. My father rested one hand on the edge of the podium. For most of my career, he continued, I've believed that building something meant creating deals, projects, developments. He paused briefly. But tonight my son-in-law reminded me that there are other kinds of builders. His eyes moved toward me. Teachers, he said. The word carried across the ballroom. Simple. Respectful. He glanced at the document Marcus had placed there earlier. And apparently, he added with a small breath of disbelief, some people are building the future in ways I never bothered to notice. The honesty in that sentence softened something in the room. My mother watched him quietly from her chair, her expression thoughtful. Madeline looked less certain now, too. The certainty she had carried earlier seemed to have faded into something quieter. My father cleared his throat. So before we continue celebrating my retirement, he said, I think there's something that should be acknowledged properly. He stepped slightly away from the podium and gestured toward me. My daughter Avery has spent her life doing work that matters. The words felt heavier than applause. They may not show up on financial statements, he continued, but they change lives all the same. I felt Marcus squeeze my hand gently. And tonight, my father finished, I was reminded that leadership doesn't always stand at the front of a boardroom. He paused. Sometimes it stands in a classroom. The room slowly began to clap. Not loud at first, but sincere. And for the first time in my life, the applause wasn't for my sister. It was for me. The applause didn't fade right away. It moved slowly through the ballroom, like a wave that didn't quite know where to stop. Not loud and explosive the way applause usually sounded at my father's business events. This was quieter, softer, almost thoughtful. People weren't clapping because someone had closed a deal. They were clapping because something honest had happened in a room that was usually built for performance. For a moment, I didn't know what to do with that. My entire life I had learned how to disappear in rooms like this. How to smile politely while attention passed over me and landed somewhere more impressive, usually on Madeline, usually on a contract or a number that sounded important. But now the attention had settled on me. And it stayed. Marcus leaned slightly closer to me and said quietly, You don't have to do anything. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. That simple sentence grounded me again. Because he was right. For once, I didn't need to explain myself. I didn't need to defend my choices or prove the value of my life. I could just stand there. My father eventually raised a hand, and the applause softened until the room settled again. I suppose, he said with a faint smile, that's the most honest speech this retirement party will ever get. A few gentle laughs moved through the crowd. Then he looked toward Marcus. And Marcus, he added, I believe I owe you an apology as well. Marcus shook his head slightly. You don't owe me anything. My father held his gaze for a moment. No, he said quietly, but I do owe my daughter the respect you showed her tonight. That sentence changed something in the room again. Not dramatically, but you could feel the shift. My mother watched silently from her chair. Madeline looked thoughtful for the first time all evening, as if she were seeing the situation from a different angle now. No one tried to restart the argument. No one needed to. The truth had already been said. Marcus glanced down at me and spoke softly. Ready to go home? I nodded. We didn't need to stay for the rest of the speeches, the desserts, or the small talk that would eventually fill the room again. The important part of the evening had already happened. As we walked toward the exit, people stepped aside. Some smiled politely, others nodded with a kind of quiet respect. Jennifer Lawson stopped Marcus briefly near the door. I meant what I said earlier, she told him. EduSpark is doing extraordinary work. Marcus thanked her politely. But when he turned back toward me, I saw that same calm expression in his eyes. Because he understood something that the rest of the room was only just beginning to realize. Tonight had never really been about his company. It had been about me. Outside, the cool night air wrapped around us as the ballroom doors closed behind us. The noise inside faded into the distance. For a moment we just stood there together under the city lights. You okay? Marcus asked. I looked up at the sky, then back at him. And for the first time in a very long time, The answer came easily. Yes, because somewhere between the microphone, the silence, and the truth finally being spoken, something inside me had changed. For 32 years, I had been waiting for my parents to decide my life was enough. Tonight, I realized something much more important. It always had been. And if you've ever spent years feeling unseen by the people who were supposed to understand you the most, then you probably know how powerful a moment like that can be. Strength doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's patient. Sometimes it's simply the moment you stop asking for permission to matter. If this story stayed with you, if you understand that kind of quiet strength, then you already know why stories like this exist. If you understand quiet strength, you belong here. Subscribe. Because sometimes the most powerful ending isn't revenge, it's clarity. And the quiet peace that comes when you finally believe in your own worth.